Julia Fowler stood nervously in front of the grand Hartford mansion, her heart racing as she prepared for a job interview that could change her life. At 26, she was a single mother to her 4-year-old daughter Mia, and after losing her job at a local restaurant, she was desperate for work. The advertisement for a housemaid at the historic estate seemed like her only chance. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her worn blouse, smoothed her hair, and rang the doorbell, her stomach churning with a mix of anxiety and hope. The door swung open to reveal Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, who scrutinized Julia with an air of authority that made her feel small. "You must be the new applicant," Mrs. Thompson said, inspecting Julia from head to toe. Julia nodded, feeling the weight of the woman's gaze. "Come in." As she stepped inside, Julia felt the enormity of the space envelop her. The entrance hall was vast, adorned with crystal chandeliers that hung from a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into the heavens. A grand mahogany staircase curved gracefully, leading to the second floor, and the marble floor was polished to such perfection that Julia could see her own warped reflection in it. "Wow," she said before she could stop herself. "This place is bigger than the whole grocery store where I shop." "Mrs. Thompson gave her a disapproving look, but Julia thought she saw a tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile, almost. "Mrs. Hartford will see you in the sitting room. Follow me and please try to keep your comments to yourself." As they walked through what felt like endless hallways, Julia tried to remember the path, but it was impossible. A right turn, then a left, another hallway, and a staircase that came out of nowhere. It was a maze of luxury, and she was already lost. They arrived at a room with huge windows, where Eleanor Hartford, the family matriarch, sat in an armchair, looking regal. She appeared to be around 60, with the upright posture of a ballerina, soft gray hair styled in perfect waves, and a pearl necklace that probably cost more than everything Julia owned. "Mrs. Hartford, this is Julia Fowler." "Mrs. Thompson announced. Eleanor looked up from her teacup and studied Julia the way someone might examine a questionable painting. "Sit down, Miss Fowler." Julia obeyed, sitting on the edge of the armchair, trying to look professional while her heart raced. "Do you have experience as a housemaid?" Eleanor's voice was steady and direct. "Not exactly, ma'am." Julia admitted, deciding honesty was her best bet. "But I worked 3 years as a waitress in a busy restaurant. I know how to clean, stay organized, deal with difficult customers, and I have a 4-year-old daughter, so I really understand the idea of cleaning a mess while another one is being made." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that answer. "A daughter?" "Yes, ma'am. Mia. She stays with my best friend during the day. It won't affect my work. I promise." Silence hung in the air as Eleanor took a slow sip of tea, her eyes never leaving Julia's face. The tension in the room grew thick. Julia started to regret bringing up Mia, but surprisingly, Eleanor smiled a small smile, but a real one. "I like honesty, Miss Fowler. And I like women who don't bend easily." Eleanor gently set down her teacup. "You're hired. Mrs. Thompson will explain your duties." Julia blinked, stunned. "Really? Just like that?" "I have a good instinct for people," Eleanor said as she stood with grace. "And something tells me you have the kind of strength this house needs. Don't disappoint me." "I won't, ma'am. You can count on me." Julia was practically bouncing in her seat, excitement lighting up her face as Mrs. Thompson led her back through the hallways, explaining schedules, responsibilities, and house rules. Julia tried to focus, but her mind was still racing from the unexpected turn of events. Finally, something was going right in her life. As they walked down the main hallway, Julia noticed the walls were covered with huge gold-framed portraits. Generations of Hartford stared out solemnly from their frames, men in suits, women in elegant dresses, and children who looked far too serious for their age. Suddenly, Julia stopped walking, her entire body freezing as she stared at one large commanding portrait in the center of the wall. A young man smiled confidently at the camera, his deep brown eyes and slightly crooked smile striking a chord in her heart. It was the dimple in his chin that made her blood run cold, the same dimple Mia had. Panic surged through her as she realized that the man in the portrait was Eric, the man who had vanished from her life 5 years ago without explanation, without saying goodbye, and without a trace. The man she had searched for during months before finally giving up. The man who never knew she was pregnant. Mia's father. Julia felt as if the air had been knocked out of her. Miss Fowler? Mrs. Thompson's voice sounded far away, muted by the shock flooding her senses. Are you all right? You look pale. Julia couldn't answer. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. That face. Those eyes. She knew every detail of that face because she saw it every day reflected in her daughter's little face. It was him. Ma'am, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. Why is the father of my child in the portrait hanging in your house? The silence that fell over the hallway was heavy and suffocating. Eleanor visibly turned pale, her eyes widening as they shifted from Julia to the portrait and back again. Mrs. Thompson gasped, covering her mouth in shock. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice low and controlled but filled with urgency. Mrs. Thompson, she commanded, clear this hallway immediately. Everyone out now. The housekeeper hesitated only for a second before rushing down the hallway, motioning frantically at the staff who had begun to appear out of curiosity. Doors closed quickly, and fast footsteps echoed until, in less than a minute, the hallway was empty, leaving only Julia and Eleanor, the portrait of Eric watching them silently. Eleanor fully turned to Julia, her face filled with a storm of emotions, shock, confusion, and something deeper that Julia couldn't quite name. You, Eleanor finally said, taking a deep breath to compose herself. You're coming to my office now, and you're going to tell me everything. Absolutely everything. Julia nodded, still staring at the portrait that held her past. The man who had left her, the man who had vanished, Mia's father was there, smiling from the walls of the Hartford mansion, and Julia was about to find out why. Eleanor Hartford walked ahead with firm steps, but Julia noticed her hands trembling slightly. The office was at the end of another long hallway, and with every step, Julia felt her heart tighten even more. When they entered, Eleanor closed the door with excessive care, as if afraid someone might hear. The office was elegant and serious, with bookshelves covering the walls and a mahogany desk at the center, the scent of old leather and polished wood hanging in the air. Eleanor pointed to a chair across from the desk. Sit down, she instructed. Julia obeyed, crossing her arms defensively. Eleanor walked to a sideboard, poured herself a glass of water with shaking hands, and slowly turned around. That portrait, Eleanor began, her voice calm but tense. That's my son, Jacob Hartford, heir to Hartford Investments. Julia let out a short, humorless laugh. Jacob? That's funny. The man I knew went by Eric. Just Eric. No fancy last name, no mansion, nothing but a backpack, and stories about traveling the world. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength. Explain from the beginning. Julia took a deep breath, preparing to lay everything bare. 5 years ago, I was working at a coffee shop in Charleston. One day, this handsome guy came in easy smile, laid-back attitude. He said he was traveling around the country with no rush and no specific destination. We started talking, and he came back the next day and the next. Julia paused, the memory vivid. He told me his name was Eric, that he was a backpacker who had no family and lived doing odd jobs. We connected, you know. Eleanor listened in silence, her face pale and steady. We spent 3 weeks together. They were the best 3 weeks of my life, Julia continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. He was funny, caring, different from anyone I'd ever met. And then one morning he was just gone. No warning, no note, no explanation. He disappeared like he'd never existed. And you got pregnant? Eleanor asked softly. Bingo, Julia replied sarcastically. I found out 2 weeks after he vanished. I tried to find him, spent money I didn't have trying to track him down. But how do you look for someone when you only know their first name? When everything they told you was a lie? Eleanor sank into the chair behind the desk, her composure finally beginning to crack. Are you absolutely sure it's him in the portrait? Ma'am, I spent 3 weeks looking at that face. And I've spent 4 years looking at the miniature version of it every time I look at my daughter. Julia leaned forward, her voice firm. Mia has the same eyes, the same crooked smile, the same little dimple on her chin. So, yes, I'm sure. Eleanor covered her face with her hands for a moment. When she lowered them, her eyes were red. This can't be happening, she murmured. Well, it is, Julia replied, crossing her arms. And now you're going to tell me why Eric or Jacob or whatever name he goes by these days was pretending to be some broke backpacker when he's actually heir to a fortune? Eleanor stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens. 5 years ago, my husband passed away. It was sudden and devastating. Jacob, he didn't take it well. He felt lost. He started questioning everything. The business, the responsibilities, the future. One day, he just left. Said he needed time, that he needed to figure out who he was without the weight of the Hartford name. Julia listened intently, trying to process the information. That still doesn't excuse lying to me, she said firmly. No, it doesn't, Eleanor agreed. But maybe it explains it. He was trying to be someone else, someone who didn't have to carry the Hartford name. And in the process, he created an even bigger weight, a daughter he doesn't even know exists. Eleanor nodded sadly. He needs to know. He needs to take responsibility. I couldn't agree more, Julia said. They sat in silence, watching Mia chase a butterfly through the garden, her laughter filling the air. Then they heard footsteps approaching. They turned to see Jacob walking toward them, his expression a mixture of confusion and surprise as he looked at the two women and then at Mia, who was blissfully unaware of the storm about to unfold. Julia's heart raced as she realized the moment had finally arrived, a confrontation she had been both dreading and anticipating. She took a deep breath, ready to stand her ground for Mia, ready to face the man who had left her alone with their child.